Haere welcome and to the Strategy and Policy meeting of today, 19th of May. We have an apology from Peter McDonald. Is there any other apologies? If not, would someone like to move that the apology be accepted? Thank you, Councillor McCallum. Seconded, David Stevens. Those in favour would say aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do we have any? The chair has not been notified of any. Similarly with 4, public forum petitions and deputations. I haven't been alerted to any. Let's move to the confirmation of minutes. Item 5 in your papers. So, would someone like to move that they be accorded as an accurate record of the meeting? Thank you, David Stevens. Seconded, Nicole Horrell. Right there, accuracy is open for discussion. Are there any erratum or omissions? Yes, Lyndall.
Mr. Chairman, on page 3 of the minutes, which is actually page 7, it's just a grammatical moment in there. And the last paragraph.
Which line?
Third line, the word where doesn't need to be there. I don't think. Hang on. I read it about 10 times.
Mrs. Hicks advised the EC judge was the same one who has been involved throughout and signs off on where matters finally conclude.
Where matters. Maybe you can take the on off.
On needs to leave.
Sorry, thank you. I was
On's the word.
Shannon Ling, former councillor in
In the absence of Councillor Rodway, it's a sterling effort. Is there any other?
Can't compete with it.
No, that's pretty good. All right. If there are no other things requiring explanation, I'll put the motion that the minutes be accepted. Those in favour would say aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Let's move to item, hang on a minute. Question, notification of extraordinary urgent business. Not aware of any questions. Ian?
The only question I have really is one I spoke to you on Sunday night about was the, do we have the ability to have this copy of the draft staff submission?
Yeah, I've talked to Lucy about that and we'll deal with that under, what is item 2? Yeah, that's the one you're referring to, I think. Yep, certainly. We'll have a more fulsome discussion at that point. Right then, let's move to item 1, land transport rule setting speed limits. Who's,
I was expecting Russell.
Lucy? Right. Oh, we need Russell.
I'll step up.
Where to go, Russell?
We'll talk at least about the process of this point, Mr. Shears.
Yeah. Thank you. Here he comes. Welcome, Russell. Come up to the desk. We don't muck about here. You're on. Thank you. Lead us through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there are changes coming in the speed management area. It was signalled in a document earlier from the Ministry of Transport because it's being done under a rule. Other organisation that are doing the consultation. There are potentially significant issues for your regional transport committees. By association, there will be some potentially issues for the council. So the process that is being proposed is one that the Regional Transport Committee will coordinate the preparation of a plan that includes speed management, speed limit changes for each of the organisations, each of the AOs in their area. and will consult on that plan. And I think you've probably all seen the results of current consultation when the speed limit reduction in particular is proposed. They tend to be somewhat controversial. So that is being taken from the Road Controlling Authority and put firmly in the hands of the Regional Transport Committee, without necessarily giving the Regional Transport Committee any authority to do anything about changes at the other end of the consultation. So it's a bit of a haphazard process at the present time. As I've indicated in the report, the Transport Special Interest Group, TSIG, have already made submissions informally to the Ministry of Transport. They asked us for our comments. It would be fair to say that the issues that we raised on behalf of the sector at that stage haven't really been addressed in the final proposal, but they've given us the reasons why they didn't address them. Not things that we necessarily agree with. And they only arrived yesterday, so I couldn't incorporate any of those comments into the report. The biggest issue, I think, for the council is that by association, this rule does not mention the council in any shape or form. It only mentions regional transport committees. So it's a regional transport committee that prepares the plan and consult on it and submits it to the final plan to the agency. There is no requirement for council to sign off on it. However, if there's a big lot of controversy around speed management changes or speed limit changes, the Regional Transport Committee is a committee of council, and by association, I believe that the council there's a reputational risk, if you like, potential for the council. And it's a component that's not specifically mentioned in the report, but has come up through our discussions with at TSIG level again, as the sector is coming to terms with what this might actually mean. So at this stage, the report is to let you know that the rule is out there. It's likely to come into force later in the year. The sorts of things that we may well want to make submission on have, I believe, already been turned down by the Ministry of Transport. The Transport Agency are determined to see this rule put into place, and I suspect that it's barrelling down that route come hell or high water. So happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you. There would need to be a bit of flexibility. I was thinking with rural schools where if the school is actually adjacent to the road, but the entrance to the school is on the side street. I was thinking of Knapdale School where the school sign and the school grounds are against the road, but any child access to vehicles is well up on a side road, and it would be pointless to reduce speed limit in the case like that where there is absolutely no danger. So there would need to be a bit of give and take on this.
So as with all of these things, the devil actually is sitting in the detail, and the rule doesn't include detail. The rule has a little catch-all in it that says that the Transport Agency will produce guidance, and they'll tell us, or tell the AOs, road controlling authorities, how they've got to assess the schools, etc. And that guidance is still somewhere in the background. We haven't seen any shape. But you're right. If you look at Invercargill, if you come out North Road, or there's 3 or 4 places coming out here that you could have school signs without and they may all be relatively justified for very short periods of time.
Yeah, councillor Guyton.
Thanks, Mr Chairman. Yeah, thank you. With regard to the committee and the lack of need, it seems, for the committee to put its findings or recommendations or whatever through the respective councils, does that conflict with the rules that the committee already has?
It's something I haven't specifically looked at. It would be fair to say that the committee would report back to council. I mean, you would know what was going on. But whereas with the regional land transport plan, the committee recommends the adoption of that plan to council, and council passes a resolution to adopt the plan and submit it to the agency. In this case, that's not a component of the plan rule. So whilst the committee would be reporting to council either, and you could be asking for a separate report, or it could be done through the minutes of the meeting. It'd certainly be done through the minutes of an RTC. And you could ask for a separate report that I would produce for you. It would be a report for your information.
Councillor Beard.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So the speed limit one's going to be, I'd say, reasonably contentious as to who brings forward suggestions for lowering the speed limit. And I imagine, in the short term anyway, there won't be any avenue for speed limit increases beyond, obviously, 100 k's. But so mainly what we're looking at is speed limit decreasing. So is it likely that it's going to be initiated from within the regions, or do we see more pressure coming from either the transport agency or somewhere else that's going to want us to lower speed limits? And then what do you see actually in the process? How does that feed through into its local democracy?
So there are some road controlling authorities in the country, and I don't necessarily suggest the Southland ones are in this situation, that are really keen on seeing reduced speed limits across their areas. The state highway sector is in the process of assessing all of the state highways at the moment, and there are a large number of areas within the state highway sector that will come forward, will be put into this plan as a result at an 80 or 90 kilometre an hour speed limit. The tool that they are using, that the agency have developed, is called Megamaps. And Megamaps has a series of algorithms in the back of it that looks at the crash data, looks at deaths and serious injuries on various sections of roads and types of roads, and assesses those roads for personal risk and collective risk, and then comes up through an algorithm to say that the safe and appropriate speed for this section of road is whatever it might be. So I suspect that if you put a road controlling authority in a situation where the Megamaps indicate that the safe and appropriate speed on a number of their roads is, and I'll say for example 80 kilometres an hour, it will be interesting to see where liability falls if they don't reduce the speed limit to 80 kilometres an hour and somebody dies on that section of road.
So will Megamaps then be...
That's not addressed in the rule, but so the Megamaps tool that the agency have prepared suggests the speed limits that are appropriate, and the councils will then take that and information, and they have to do a separate assessment to say that yes, they believe that that is the right figure, and the guidance will tell them how they go about that, and then that new speed limit will be incorporated into the plan.
That's say the state highways and for TA's roading network.
So there's two proposed systems that run sort of concurrently. They are national, at least they're assessing the state highways nationally, so from one end of the country to the other. And to take the approval process away from the Transport Agency for approving their own state highway speed limits, they're setting up a speed management committee who will look at that. Whereas the TA roads, the local roads, will be assessed by the local authority themselves. The recommendations from those authorities will go into the speed management plan, and the speed management plan is then signed off by the Transport Agency. So there's two, but the two systems are aligned, but they're actually separate. And that's one of the major issues that through TSIG that we've identified is the fact that decisions on the state highways are being made by a different authority. We would certainly prefer to see the local roads, one going through the same approval committee. But it doesn't look as though they've brought that out in our previous discussions with the Ministry of Transport.
Councillor Ludlow?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. This implies to me that there's a whole lot more work and a whole lot more cost for some areas of committees and things. You've mentioned that there's maybe provision for a 0.5 FTE. Is that given that ours is a Otago Southern committee, is that per council or per committee?
No, that'd be per committee. So the proposal is that, and once again, the devil will be in the detail, but they're suggesting that this speed management plan will actually be worked through in the same timeframe as an RLTP. Now, if you're going to try and do that to us, then I'll be blunt, I don't want to be here for it. Sorry, Bruce. Because it's just not going to be possible. There is not the resource, there's not the expertise within the regional planning sector to be able to do it. The other thing is that the concept of this plan is that of these speed limit changes will inform the activity management plans that councils produce for their roading networks, and subsequently the programs of work that they put forward. So you've actually got to do them in advance of having an RLTP. So I believe, at least I think, that a 0.5 will allow the additional work over the 3 years. Don't ask me where you get the resources from.
Right.
Because across the sector they are not available.
Yeah. Councillor Stevens?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Yeah, obviously we need more detail, and I wonder whether we should go back to them and give some direction as to requiring that, Mr Chairman. I mean, I look at, there's obviously going to be more cost. I'm looking at road safety cameras. I'm not quite sure what a road safety camera is. Excuse my ignorance, but is that a speed camera or is it something else? Obviously there's more cost going to be involved in that, but no, I think we need more detail to wrap around this. Thank you.
The regional council won't incur, the only additional cost the regional council will incur will be in that planning faction. The cost for any infrastructure, cameras, etc., fall within the road controlling authority, and they will be funded on the state highway sector straight out of the National Land Transport Fund, and if they are proposed, and they may not be, within the local road sector, they will be funded through their roading programs. So there's no risk in terms of that funding. And if you look at the current government's emphasis on safety and in fact speed reduction and safety cameras, etc., and the fact that they set up a whole new activity class called Road to Zero, they believe that they are putting the funding aside to actually be able to meet those commitments.
Chairman Horrell?
Yes, Mr Chairman, there's some concerns on this. I mean, the reason, and we're seeing it quite a lot, that the current process has proven to be costly and inefficient. I'm struggling to see by setting up a separate entity, unless there's a clear pathway for NZTA who are actually maintaining the roads and the regions to be able to contribute. I think this is going to be a costly, rigid structure, and that's not really going to solve the issues we're supposed to be solving. If it takes them 18 months for this agency to actually do something, if you want to change, how long is that going to take? So that there is concerns, but I would say that the biggest one is if there's a centralisation again, if there's not a clear pathway for regional flavour and conversations, then I'm very worried that we're not going to see any change from costly and inefficient and concerns about road safety.
Do you want to respond to that, or will you just absorb that?
The current process is very rigid in the way that a local authority has to go about assessing whether a speed limit change can take place. And they can be, the requests can be driven from all sorts of local community groups, etc., that push and that's not to say that that can't still happen, but and the consultation, individual consultation, or as councils go through, 60, 70 councils go through bylaw processes because they have to set bylaws to set the speed limits. And they have to do that every 4 or 5 years to review them. It is actually a long, involved and a costly process. And our TAs have been growling about that process for a long time. So there's a degree of, I suppose, some of the cost of that is actually being shoved onto a regional council in place of the local council. But they believe that by the use of these mega maps, etc., and the different method of actually assessing whether speed limit changes should take place, will make it easier and easier to justify, which is the devil's in the detail, I'm sorry.
Well, just supplementary, the temporary road speed changes are still with the local authorities, and the roads that aren't NZTA are still with the locals.
Doesn't have any effect on setting the temporary speed limits or emergency speed limits or anything like that. It's a permanent.
We see some that have been reduced because of actually the state of the road. My worry is if it's set at a central level and the road's fixed, you might still wait for years before you can have any change.
Those will still apply the way that they do.
Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. After just been through a hearing process and the work that has to be done and the complexity of it, to stick another massive big hurdle on top is going to be a challenge in itself. And you've done the same, I know, in a previous term. I think we shouldn't underestimate the time involved to actually make this happen, in this way outlined. And I think my conversations with Russell would suggest that this is not just about speed limits past schools. This could actually be far bigger than that. And I think we should not underestimate that we've got basically a regional council setting the rules for a process for everybody, but we don't actually have direct controls. We're actually recommending to another party to get sign off. So I'm just, from a personal point of view, I'd actually like to come back and actually get whatever was recommended signed off, the same as we do with the RLTP plan, because that just gives us confidence we're on the right track and we've got community behind us. But there is quite a lot of stuff in here that we don't know yet and we don't understand yet. and that needs to be clarified. I agree with the pathway, we're not quite clear about the pathway, and we need to be clear about that.
Lucy?
So sorry in response to, and it's come up a couple of times, I just wanted to talk to the devil in the detail point. One of the efficiencies that from my understanding, that they're hoping to achieve is from consolidating the need for consultation. And it's that we don't know exactly the quantity of, or the cost of, or the implications of. And certainly from your question about linkages with the TAs and linkages with those other parties, that's where the relationships and the implications of this are really going to need to be teased out. So I'm really keen for us to come back with more details once they are slightly more visible, and we can talk more in detail about how we might approach it. Once we've got a clear idea about the timeframes and how it's going to go in between RLTPs or not, we'll be able to do, I mean, you would be aware, Russ was planning for RLTPs, you know, it's not a thing that happens a couple of months out, it's a very long drawn out process, and so we need to be putting the same amount of energy into planning for these to make sure that we're doing it as efficiently as we can.
I have 3 questions. Number one, do we have some timelines on the development of this so that we can sort of have some expectations about when this is going to happen and the process to make it happen?
From the regional sector's point of view, that I'm pretty involved in, we have a session with Transport Agency where they are going to come and explain some of the devil next week. They will be coming to the Regional Transport Committee at the beginning of June to explain some of the detail. The indication is that they are expecting the rule to come into effect, to be signed off by the government before Christmas. That sets the clock then on when we start the speed management review process, although many of the TAs will actually be doing the background work now. So my expectation would be that early in the new year, 2022, somewhere around about that, we would be looking at starting the regional speed management plan process, developing the components that we need to. At this stage, it'll have to be signed off by 2024 at the same time as the RLTP, but it'll need to actually have been progressed and well before that. So I think time it'll start in this next financial year at the very least.
Thank you. My next question was, and it's been echoed by some people, it's just the lack of detail that's here. So if I look on page 12, proposal 5, establishment of an independent speed management committee, that sounds like a great idea, but who would appoint those people? Do we know the detail around that? Is that going to be a government appointee thing, or is that going to be an RTC thing? Here's the reason why I raised that, because of something else that I'm involved in. Quite often, people with second agendas get appointed to these. So this could be dominated by people with an interest in climate change, cycling, pedestrians, who have a separate agenda. And those issues need to be considered. But we need to be very careful about appointees to committees with second agendas, because so my question is, do we know who appoints those people? It's fine saying we need an independent speed management committee, but are they to be government appointees or from the RTC or from local authorities, or what's the issue? How's that work? We don't know.
The government, the Minister of Transport will appoint the people to that committee.
Oh dear.
And I'll be me to comment on your...
No, okay, fine, no, well, okay, that's fine. Well, sorry, Lucy?
Just to be clear, that's not the local committee, that I'm reading that right.
That's a national committee?
Yeah, that's the
Okay.
national
That's the one that's that's the one that will approve the
Okay,
state highway program. But your comments are relevant.
I think they are. They've given me a bit of grief in another area. However, now my third question is, do we need to make some statements to Councillor McCallum and Beard, I think, are the members of the RTC, are they? Yeah. So for this next meeting, that just collect up where our thoughts are at this stage, or have you gentlemen got enough feeling for what's being suggested, or do you have any, yeah, what's happening?
To me, I guess this is both news to you, it's news to us as well, really, because we haven't had a lot of awareness of this part of the process, other than there's been some discussion over speed limits, and in the Road to Zero program, it has been overtures that there's going to be something coming, particularly on the state highways regarding speed limits, but how it's going to be shaped, we're only now starting to see it as well. So I think I'm looking for a bit more information too as to understanding.
I think if I could sum up the meeting, where I sense the mood is, we would like to have more detail coming back here, especially around some of the more specifics that we might have a discussion on it. I think that would be a message we would like you to take to that next RTC meeting.
We're happy to do that, Mr. Chair. I think it would be good to be.
I think that's the key. This is a bit of a taste of something that's coming down the line, and I think our message is we want to be included, not to just be the.
I'd actually go a little bit further than that and say, because this will be an inaugural system, we are starting from a clean sheet of paper. So we're not actually totally sure what has to go in. We'll be big borrowing, stealing stuff from everybody else. And then we're going to have to work relationships to a degree that we haven't actually worked before to this level of detail, because it's been done at a different level. So your comments, Mr. Chairman, are taken on board. We'll, once we've had the first and the next meeting, we'll be able to give you some more detail. But this looks like it's moving very fast. I knew it was coming. Russ and I have had a couple of discussions on it. This is the first detail I've seen in sort of written form, but we'll keep that in mind.
Any other comments? Someone like to move the recommendation? Yeah, Bonnie, Alan and Bonnie put the motion. Those in favour would say aye.
Aye.
Against no, that's agreed. Item 2, the consultation document on phasing out fossil fuels.
Preferred side.
Camera.
Right. Lead us through it.
Right. So this item's on the MFE consultation document, which is phasing out of fossil fuels and process heat for national direction on industrial greenhouse gas emissions. It's impossible to remember that title. Anyway, got through it. So the government's delivering on its commitments to tackle climate change. It's the first major announcement following the release of the Climate Change Commission's draft package of advice that we covered earlier this year. So government believe that decarbonising process heat, which is reducing fuel used in manufacturing and production, is the biggest opportunity for New Zealand to reduce its energy emissions. Process heat is the second largest source of energy-related emissions after transport. So, in this document, specifically, government is proposing an NES and or NPS by December of this year to provide nationally consistent direction. And in it, they're looking at wanting to phase out existing coal burners by 2037 and prohibit new coal boilers. They're also looking at phasing out other fossil fuels through a new consenting process, reconsenting and good management practice requirements. So we're talking about greenhouse gas emission plans for everybody. So we've got the opportunity to submit on the proposals. Well, those submissions close tomorrow. In my opinion, a formula and opinion, NFE are well researched on the scale of the impact, which is exactly why they're targeting this area of change. And I recommend that we would focus our influence on the tools and resources or the extra information that we might need to enable us to carry out these duties. So we can give you a draft of the submission that we've started to prepare if you wanted to consider that overnight. Now we're really interested if you want to share any ideas or recommendations or
So we will,
points to
what are you
discuss.
suggesting we hand out that submission to councillors?
So I might just through you, Mr Chair, we've got a draft version and I've requested the ministry give us an extension till next week for us to submit the actual submission. So if it's through you, we can circulate this after the meeting and you guys can have longer than
What's the
just overnight.
status of it? It's confidential to?
Yes, just
Right.
draft for us
We'll
for
just
the
be
moment.
clear about that,
Yeah,
that it's not
and
a
then-
public document at this stage.
No,
It's in draft only.
It's in draft at the moment,
Righto.
and if you'd all like to read and consider and then send any feedback you might have to myself, and we'll make sure that we feed that into the submission and hopefully they are willing to accept a slightly late submission and we'll get it into them by the middle of next week is what we're hoping. So I've asked for a week's extension. So if you wanna have, did you wanna talk about the webinar a little? Just the direction that they were given, that they gave you at the webinar, or?
When I attended a webinar with other council representatives, and that's where I got that impression that they're well researched on the kind of the scale of the impact, and that they're really looking at the tools that we might need. So stuff like how we go about the reconsenting and the greenhouse gas emission plans, these good management practice plans, what we might need to be able to prepare and monitor and enforce those sort of things.
So as with lots of these kinds of consultation, there's many, many questions. We haven't gone through question by question and answered everything. Given the direction that was given via the information session Anastasia attended, they were really keen to focus our feedback, or for our feedback to be focused on a number of key points, and that's how the submission's been framed up. So themes around the prohibition of coal, which is one thing that they're talking about, how they're regulating new fossil fuels, the consents review, reissuing as we've mentioned, and also the implementation of those new emissions plans. So
Okay, councillor Guyton?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Yes, it's a detail which may not be within our sphere, but I'm just thinking about the proposed expansion to the coal mining in Ojai and whether we have any connection with the council that's going to be or has given consent for that, and whether they have to take into account and what that means. So that's like a lot of questions.
Well, I know that MFE's aware that it's like one of the 4 major coal mining places in New Zealand, so they're aware that it's a major industry. The current consent would go through the district council rather than us, and the way that our only influence would be on mining activities and air discharge with sort of nuisance dust. That would be our only comment. I think we could.
You're right, you want
one
a
of the,
question?
we've included as part, one of the things we've included as part of the draft submission is the acknowledgement though that that coal mine operation is a significant employer for the local community, and the implications of that and on the prohibition of coal haven't been worked through, and so we're acknowledging the fact that from a Southlands community perspective that would have an impact, but we don't know what the scale or size of that impact would be, and as Anastasia said, we don't regulate the operation other than via those conditions.
Yeah, councillor Beard, I've got you, councillor S. Are you finished?
No, I just wanted to ask one other thing with regard, again, a downstream effect with regard the Fonterra burning of coal en masse. Are you aware of any response from them? I mean, I guess they're not aware of, well, they'll be aware of some.
Shall I answer it?
Yeah, councillor McCallum's probably.
I was at a meeting as recently as 48 hours ago. Fonterra is working on the fact of not having coal burners by 2037. That's the end game. The question I was going to raise is that it was about the follow-on infrastructure that's needed to do that, and whether you go power and whether you go wood pellet, there is significant investment needed for either of those options. So I can give you more detail, but they are aware of it and that they're working to this date. 2037 is the short answer on all sites, and they're looking at it right through to their tanker fleet right now.
electrifying the tanker fleet. All that work is on the table. I can't give you an outcome, but they are taking it seriously from the state.
Have Fonterra then changed their view? Because I understood they were on a 5-year plan to stop using coal at Edendale. I think I've heard that from you, but
No, not, they have,
37's a long way out.
that's the government deadline for this, and that's what they're working to, because, for them to go electric, if I'm Mr. Chairman, they would have to put a new power line from Makarewa to the site. That's multi-millions of dollars, plus the work on site, plus that would actually mean that Tiwai couldn't run because of the significant power supply issues that go with that. Even if you had a wood pellet process, the tonnages that were needed to go through their plant to actually create the heat units they need to actually manufacture, you get into a different regime, and this paper doesn't cover the infrastructure redevelopment of our power network through Southland. There is a lot of stuff in here, if you look at it on its face value, sort of makes sense. But if you're looking for where's the pathway to actually go and find a new diesel, find a new support mechanism for the emissions that are being targeted here, it's vacant. It's not there. And the investment and who pays for it and who leads it is not there. So we can actually drive a behaviour through consenting process, but the options, apart from closure, those options are not actually portrayed in a mechanism. We've just got some dates and some high-level thinking of the detail.
I have councillor Beard, councillor Wrestler, so I'll take councillor Beard first.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So just in awareness or quantum, how many consent holders are there who would be in this category of I guess large fossil fuel users that might need to come to us to get a consent?
So we had 89, let's say 34 have large scale combustion emissions. It's hard with the way that the consents are written but we think that that's going to be the number that are coal and fossil fuel.
So does that include schools and hospitals, or is that largely just commercial entities?
So through you, Chair, yeah, it does conclude a couple of hospital health spaces. It also covers meatworks, industrial sites, the lime works, Fonterra that we've already talked about, timber processing, aggregate production, and also wool industry as well. And I think worth noting that all of those 34 have got a wide variety of expiration dates on their consents, some of which would be coming up in the next 2 years, 3 years. Others stretch out as far as 2045. So the implications in terms of how we would review those would need to be addressed slightly differently depending on where they are.
Right, councillor Wrestler?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering, the fossil fuel is quite a broad term, whether there is, within that, there's a ranking, or, I mean, lignite would be at the top of the list, and then coal, and then you've got, I suppose, diesel and fuel oil and natural gas. I'm just wondering whether they all have the same level of urgency for being phased out, and whether the alternative, things like biofuels or wood pellets or wood, are necessarily the best replacement, because they also produce greenhouse gases. I'm just wondering whether there's a bit more to it than what we've got here.
Very technical, who's going to answer?
So,
Anastasia?
so the document focuses on coal first up, and then it defines the fossil fuels as 3 there. So it's LPG, diesel, and natural gas. Get it right? Yeah. And the biofuel stuff.
Yeah.
Being interested.
Yes.
In
Yeah, so the National Air Quality SIG, the working group that represents the air quality experts, so ON West is our rep on that group. That's one of the things that they're flagging as part of their submission, is that if you converted all, and you mentioned it as well, if you converted everything from coal to biomass, the implications for increases in particulate matter would need to be taken account of, and that there would need to be other mechanisms put in place during the transition to ensure that those emissions didn't increase as a result of the switch.
Comments from myself here. just would encourage councillors to plug into those government sites. I'll get you in a minute, Nicole. Plug into those government sites that have a more fulsome explanation of the, what was it, Operation Pete or whatever it's called, yeah, and then respond back to Lucy with your comments. From my point of view, I'm just a little, well, I'm quite enthused by the fact that we're getting something other than the mantra 80% of New Zealand's problem comes from agriculture, which of course is rubbish, and we're actually starting to have a look at some of these other things. And when you look at the world's consumption of 7.5 billion tonnes of fossil fuels a year, it's clearly an area that needs to be addressed if we're serious about climate change. My comment would be we need to be a bit careful that we're not looking at this in silos and just looking at coal here. And you know, while it's great that Fonterra are looking at electrification of not only the drying process but of their trucks, I'm inclined to have the view that EVs are a stopgap till we get to something in green hydrogen, and knowing that there is other things being talked about for Tiwai's power, I'm just of the view that we ought not to operate coal in a silo without thinking a bit further out, because the economies of scale of creating green hydrogen need a large source of electrical power, and there isn't likely to be another Manapori Hydro to actually achieve that anywhere in New Zealand, and we just need to be a wee bit conscious that there are more there's a range of uses that might go to. So I'll just make that comment. Councillor.
Just following on for Mr. Chairman, I think there's one thing that concerns me is there is no cohesive plan by government to how we get to energy sources that will compensate. I still can't get my head around at the moment. We've got low lakes, very little wind, and we're bringing in thousands of tonnes of Indonesian coal, but that's Indonesia's problem, it's not ours. I would have thought it's the same planet. But it actually underlines the point we haven't thought about what the alternatives are to actually replace coal in a lot of cases. And if we're honest, we should probably be less carbon miles. We should be saying, look, for a certain amount of time, we actually take it from this case, it's better coal and it's less carbon miles. The gas again, most countries are seeing gas with reasonably low on greenhouse emissions as a transition. We're basically saying, no, that's gone too. And like you, I'm not sure that electric is going to be the full answer going forward. We've got lithium, we've got other issues that are an issue, and I do believe, I think it's probably 10 years away, but hydrogen, a green fuel, there's going to have to be something else rather than just electricity. And it would be good to see that government have actually thought about this. When you read the Climate Change Commission or talk to bureaucrats in Wellington, there is no suggestion that Tiwai electricity is going to stay in the south. The whole motivation is we will use it to decarbonise part of the country. So we do. So one, we would take a hit. Ngāi Tahu are on side with us saying actually that should stay here, but there needs to be a coordinated plan. I've talked to an ex-electricity general manager and asked about Lake Onslow, and he's quite sceptical. He said it's in the wrong place. So it's actually finding renewable energy sources around the countryside that can actually get through. Otherwise, the goal's laudable, but I've got some real concerns about some of those issues. And I would have thought, because we will produce emissions from wood chips, wouldn't it be better just to set an emission limit, and if people can meet that, that's fine. The other thing is, which is also of concern, is regional councils were required to review consent conditions. If we pull in people's consents, we pay, as far as I know, is there. And that could be a significant cost. If you actually, somebody's got a consent that runs for years, is government going to come up with the money? That, I think, is a very good question, because if we are required to pull in consents early, that is a significant cost, which again would fall on our council.
All right. Any other comments? I'm a Councillor Lloyd, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just the chairman's already, Chairman Horrell's actually raised it, but Huntly's actually pouring more and more tonnes of coal to keep the lights on in Auckland than what most people realise. So we need to actually address that issue. And I wonder, reading the paper, we're going to have to pick some places that they're going to have to stay on some sort of fuel with efficiencies and limits around it. We can't change some of these places without some big consequences. And I'm also worried about the infrastructure that sits as alternative. That will mean a huge amount of emissions actually being put in place. So some of these boilers are actually set up for very specific fuels and they can't chop and change. So to chop and change, you'd actually have to replace the whole boiler. And if you do that short of their lifespan, then there's actually quite a cost. And I'm not sure who's paying for that. It's normally the end user some way or another. So I think we need to look at Huntly and the thousands of tonnes that it's consuming just to keep the society paired. And if that's not available, then we need to look at some serious generation of electricity or other fuel types. Otherwise, we're not going to actually achieve our own targets.
Yeah, in the state.
This doesn't specifically answer these guys' questions, but it might be useful that the government has set up a decarbonising industry fund, and they've just granted a heap of money to 14 companies, which totals 22.88 million, to help them in this transition away from the coal burners. So there is significant investment in transitioning the infrastructure and investigating, researching different reasons.
All right, any other questions, yes, Lucy?
Can I just add, we didn't mention it because we were talking about the kind of big players in the first instance, but if the rules go ahead and there's a new NES, and as has been outlined in the paper, it will catch people who currently aren't consented, because we don't currently consent below 5 megawatts, but this will catch some of those. So in terms of the implications, and as Russell was saying before about devil in the detail, that's going to be another implication, will be additional consenting required for those smaller scale, medium scale entities that don't currently get called by our consenting regime.
Yep.
Just clarification, would it go as low as burning coal for home heating?
No, not at this stage, that's not what they're proposing. It's that medium size, kind of 5 megawatts, is still quite a substantial one, but that will catch some of the schools. We don't have because they're not consented, we don't have good visibility over what the scale of that looks like, because they're outside of airsheds, and that within the air plan they don't have to acknowledge the fact that they are burning coal, or the scale of which. We don't have any way of catching some of that, so we've got some data but not a comprehensive understanding of what is unconsented in that space. So.
Councillor Doyle.
Thank you. To date, councils have been unable to factor into their decision-making climate change or emissions, but I see this mention of it, then there appears to be a change. Can you clarify that for me or us?
It seems to sum up the statement. That's what it will do.
Yeah, there will be a change coming through the RMA changes that are likely to come. So the climate change adaptation space, but also the 2 new pieces of legislation that will replace the RMA we've been told, will close that loophole.
All right, so that's the umbrella idea.
We've concluded our discussion. We'll take the recommendations, just reminding you that there will be a draft, which in confidence will be supplied to councillors afterwards, and that any comments,
Well, I'll be happy to move, Mr. Chairman, but I'd also like to suggest that we perhaps, I see we're meeting on Thursday, if we can get a week's saving grace, there would be a chance if councillors did want to add to it. I guess otherwise it's a bit ad
we'll
hoc.
have another look at the draft.
So I guess at least trying to get that extension. I'm pretty sure that they would give us a week. And I know the day before is not ideal, and I know staff have probably been pushed, but this is a council submission, so we need to be able to endorse it. So I'm happy to move the recommendation, but
And with the expectation we'll get a, right. Okay, and so moved, seconded, Lyndall. Any discussion? Put the motion, those in favour would say aye, against no, that's agreed. Let's move to item 3. environmental reporting series in the hands of, here we go, yep. Remo? Or just clarification, Nicole, which meeting were you referring to? Tomorrow?
I see Thursday week, we actually
Yeah.
have a workshop on that
Okay.
day that I guess is coming to, it just may be an opportune time to fit in.
Thursday week, tomorrow week. Cool.
Thank you.
Right.
Through you, Chair, Remo is going to present this paper on the.
Go.
Good morning, Chair and councillors. So I'm here to present an item which is a summary of factual information extracted from Our Land Report 2021, which is prepared by the Ministry for the Environment and Stats New Zealand. Please note that this paper is not a reiteration of staff opinions. It's just a summary of what has been presented in the report itself. The purpose of this paper is to inform Council of the Our Land Report, which is part of the New Zealand's Environmental Reporting Series. The report focuses on the causes and consequences of land use intensification in New Zealand. It also informs how climate change may affect land use in the future. The report identified key factors that drive land use in New Zealand. They are consumer preferences in domestic and overseas market, growing population and urban expansion, climate change and rising sea levels, policies on trade, immigration, housing and environment. The report also identified several implications of intensification, which include decrease in productive land due to conversion of agricultural land to urban land use. It is supported by statistical information for Southland, which states that Southland's urban area expanded by approximately 100 hectares in 6 years between 2012 to 2018. One of the other implications as well is degraded soil health due to increasing use of irrigation, loss of native vegetation, including loss of natural wetlands, which is also supported by another statistical fact on Southland, which states that from 2012 to 2018, Southland lost about 4,000 hectares of Indigenous land cover. And between 1990 to 2012, we lost almost 157 hectares of wetlands per year, mainly due to conversion of land to pasture. Moving on to the next implication that we all know includes adverse effects on freshwater. And another one is increase in greenhouse gas emissions, global temperature, and sea level rise. So this is supported by quite a few interesting statistics. The studies for this report found that dairy cattle emit more methane and excrete more nitrogen than sheep and non-dairy cattle. Report states that between 1971 and 2019, there was an increase in numbers of dairy cattle units due to the shift from sheep and beef farms to dairy farms. Southland's dairy cattle numbers increased by about 566,000 units, and sheep decreased by approximately 3.8 million units from 1994 to 2017. By the end of this century, the average global temperature is likely to be 3 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial temperature, which is quite interesting. And sea level rise, it reduces the possibility of certain land use due to flooding and inundation implications. Another implication is effects on local environment, and this is supported by local example in Southland, as the case of Mataura. So the report states that the change from sheep and beef farming to dairy farming from the mid-1980s led to a fall in employment in meat processing and an increase in dairy product processing. So these transitions can be quite difficult, particularly for small towns like Mataura that was dependent on meat processing and where unemployment rose subsequently. So that's the end of the implications that are summarised in the paper. As this paper is for informative purposes only, there are no risks or actions associated with it, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Hey, questions for Remo? Councillor Eastland?
Yes, I've got one, about the conversion of non-urban land to urban land, and it's got 83% was from pasture, I suppose, and 9% from crop and agricultural land. I'm just wondering what the balance would have been, whether there's more of a breakdown of stats. And the other one, that the total area of land is not great in terms of the whole area of farmland in New Zealand. I'm just wondering if there's been any work on, is there a measurable drop in export earnings because of conversion of agricultural or horticultural land, or is that too hard to calculate? I'm just wondering if that's ever been looked at.
So the stats that I've just presented are essentially a summary of the studies that have been done on specific indicators. And one of the indicators is increase in urban land cover. And that has been segregated by region, and it's only from 2012 to 2018. It essentially shows the increase in land cover, and that's the net area in change between that time period. And that doesn't go into the detail of, unfortunately, exports. So I think the only information that we unfortunately have available is on change in urban area cover between that time frame.
Councillor Beard? Oh, sorry. Yep.
Just to follow on, I mean, one of the implications of land use change to urban, I guess, and where it hits home is in the Pukekohe area, where, vegetable growing area, and those vegetables can be grown elsewhere, but they're further away, so higher energy costs, probably land not quite as suitable for vegetable growing as Pukekohe, so maybe not exports, but it is certainly having an impact on our ability to grow vegetables in close to the urban centres.
Yep, point well made. Councillor Beard?
Yeah, just clarifying some of the stats here, particularly under point 19, climate change and sea level rise under 19, that's page 33, where we were saying dairy cattle numbers increased by 566,000 units, and sheep decreased by 3.8 million units. So are we showing it as it is, or are we missing something there in the translation or conversion of one cattle and one sheep being a unit? Because largely they're not. So it looks like in certain quick observation, we have intensified Southland if we've dropped 3.8 million units and only put 566,000 units on.
What's a unit? In 1971, the national sheep flock was touching 70 million. It's under 30 million today. So what is a unit?
Sorry, I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to bring up that chart.
Yeah,
I think it's a stock unit,
It's a livestock number.
Number, one cat, one cow, or one sheep.
Well, that is not correct then, because we've lost 30 million units of sheep in that time.
We're talking Southland here, but I mean, my point is...
That's the Southland,
it's
right.
Southland,
Okay.
so the issue is that...
Gotcha. Right,
What is our
sorry.
multiplier for units? With one cow and one sheep, we're looking probably 7, 8, probably difference.
That's what those numbers work out at.
Yeah.
6.8.
Sorry.
Right, gotcha.
So it looks a little bit, we want more clarification of what that means, because in a simple sense, probably it looks like we've de-intensified the region rather than possibly intensified the region.
Sorry, I'm just bringing up the thing. So it says dairy cattle numbers increased by 82% nationally from 3.4 million to 6.3 million. And then bringing up the region, Southland, So it says from the period start of 1994 to 2017, the number of dairy cattle have increased by over 500,000.
Yeah, we're not arguing that point, I'm just saying, we're not adding a conversion factor there if we talk a unit. The unit suggests to a something that's definable and is one unit, whereas you've got to add a conversion to the decrease in sheep or more the increase in cattle numbers.
Sorry.
Just to clarify though, through you, Chair, we're not adding a conversion, we're telling you
You're
the
telling the
information
story.
about, this
Yeah.
is a report that's been released by Stats and by Ministry of Environment.
Did you have a comment, councillor Gordon?
Well, just that, look at, this is an old argument, I've heard it lots and lots of times, it never goes anywhere as far as I can see. But when you look further in the paper, it describes the effects of dairying on the environment and on the atmosphere. And I think that balancing those two together, you get a pretty good picture of what they're actually meaning. But I had a question.
Yeah, right.
What was that question? My question was, we've been asked, so we're being presented with this, and we're just noting it, is that correct?
Yes, that's
I just
correct,
wonder what the council's relationship becomes with this document, because earlier there was something said about agriculture's role in climate change, which seems to me to be contradicted by this paper. So in discussions and decisions we make here, can we refer to this as being an authoritative document that we will hold to, or is it just, we're just noting that it exists?
I would say it is just noting, because it's just an informative document, just so that you know what's going on in the country, and what the statistics are. If it is helpful information to back up what your opinion is, and that would serve its purpose.
And certainly, in addition to that, I would just say we'd use it in future for other policy development things that would be part of the information we would draw on for making recommendations about policy direction, as much as we would draw on other items of robust.
Jeremy, did you have a comment?
Just, I'd love to have a debate on stock units equivalents any day. That might be quite interesting. It might be a bit of a conflict around the table here, but anytime. Just in regards to, you brought up the unemployment or the employment loss and the processing in Mataura, is that it's interesting to hear that, but the reality is that there's hundreds of jobs going in the industry in the south and that moment we can't fill. So they're lost, but we haven't got the people. And it is hundreds of jobs. It contradicts that. At a point there was a decrease between restructuring and the processing. Now they're trying to get people to work there and we can't. We've got low unemployment. This is because Southlands are low, 3% or whatever. That's about the economy that runs it. There's actually nobody spare. And so it just sort of contradicts that there is a lot of jobs there in that industry, without saying we've lost those jobs.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair, I'm pretty sure the report was it was highlighting the transition. It was difficult, I suppose. I mean, there's been a shift in where people are employed, but it's in that transition phase that it's hard on towns and the communities.
Councillor Hurrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first question is this a summary of the report, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and most of it's fine when you look at the factors we're looking at, which is the factors that are driving the way we use land, the consequences of land use for well-being now into the future, and how climate change may affect land use in the future. One of the issues they touch on, which is a fairly hot topic at the moment, and I'd like to be able to us to actually submit back to them on it, is about our quality land. And Rob touched on it before with the puka kauri type soils, and all around the countryside the percentage of highly productive land we have is quite small. At the moment we have quite a move for people to buy up whole farms and put them in trees. Some of them for carbon credits that they'll just leave. And I strongly believe there should be some restrictions in them being able to plant out the high productive land. Yeah, the bulk of it, it's fine, the gullies and all the rest of it, often it's more marginal country, but for a whole lot of reasons, for keeping water in their catchments, fire breaks even. You saw it in the 80s when we had the eucalypts planted. If you allow whole farms and big areas to be planted, you actually destroy communities, you take out the houses. And I think that is the point we could actually make to them, is that there is concern in many parts of the country at the moment that with no restrictions, people will just plant the productive land as well, and I think we'll live to regret that.
Lucy?
I was just going to say, one of the things that we talked to you all about a long time ago, it feels like, was the proposed national policy statement for highly productive land, which was going to address exactly what you've just talked about. But it's there was a number of, it's on hold as far as we can tell. They're likely to be making decisions in the second half of 2021. We made submission on that at the time, and others have as well. Obviously I just was double checking the scale of the submissions. There was over 250 submissions on it, and I know in conversations that we had, it was at least 2 years ago because it was before I had Perrin, it was linked to conversations around the need to look at the NES for plantation forestry, and the fact that one of the recurring themes that we, in conversations that are playing out at the moment with MFE, and it relates to the RMA reform, is ensuring that all of these national documents are consistent and don't overlap each other and speak to each other and don't create bizarre loopholes for forests to be planted in inappropriate places, etc., etc. So there is multiple avenues of work that are happening to address some of those risks. And I know that Southland District Council is also looking at its current district plan provisions, which don't necessarily restrict plantations as much as they need to be restricted. So multi-pronged approach to deal with some of that.
In reply to that, government seems remarkably slow to move to something. Like we knew that the forestry NES was too weak. I spoke to Damon O'Connor about the land use change, and he said, well, give us examples. Well, there's quite a few examples out there, and if we wait too long, we're going to pay a consequence for it.
Councillor McCallum.
Mr. Chairman, I actually found it interesting reading this paper,
But what I found in here was they're actually reporting the trends that have already happened. And they've been responding to economic signals or other pathways. For instance, we do cattle partly because of the economics, but partly I don't want to have 3,000 or 4,000 sheep running around. They're bad on my knees and I don't want to shear them. So there is a lifestyle change with different types of cattle. And you could argue that many of us farm grass and it's our choice whether we mow it or eat it, and we have a choice of what animal eats it, as an example. That point 2A, the factors driving the way we use land, that's actually a little easy to say but very hard to understand, because we're actually competing for the same land. Whether it's a town trying to expand, whether it's a horticultural, agricultural activity or that, the consequences of our behaviour, which you've laid out in those other points, is that we've actually pushed ourselves up further into steeper slopes and more class 6, 7 and 8 land, which we've never used to use to the extent that we are. So the unintended consequences is we're trying to find ways to actually provide food and health and well-being to our communities. And we're being pushed into places that we now say we don't really want to be. And one of the points at an earlier meeting today I attended, I basically said over the last 50 or 60 years, we've actually taken the sponge out of Southland. And if we had the sponge there like it was in the past, we would have a very different conversation. But because we've developed through need to meet this challenge that's sitting in front of us, real or perceived, is we've actually had an unintended consequence. And we're trying to look at a factor, and I actually think the answer is we're measuring a result. The problem is actually where we haven't looked. I suggest, Mr. Chairman, we need to look in the global view of all these papers. What's actually telling us since the Second World War? What's actually happened to our society? It's very easy to blame one factor or another, but in actual fact, when you really look at it, we've made some, for all the right reasons, some of it's been government-led as well as development, we've made some changes to our society and our fabric that now we're seeing come through. And sometimes we actually see the result, we blame that, but in actual fact, the problem is actually caused by another behaviour somewhere else.
That is correct.
Councillor Stevens.
Just a comment in regards to forestry. In our webinar yesterday with Minister O'Connor, he commented the fact that they're looking at, and it's taking far too long, I'd have to say, class land above 5, restricting anything below that for forestry, and putting it in the hands, even class 5, in the hands of council. So to make that decision. So how long that takes, I'm not sure. Where it goes from here, I'm not sure, but that was a comment that he made.
Okay, Lucy.
That was, as far as my recollection, that could have been linked to the highly productive land NPS. So one of the things that was needed as part of the class delineation, what goes where and who's responsible for which parts. And I know one of the first steps was the map layer that was going to be being applied to enable us to manage those more
I just want to make a comment. I don't dispute the numbers under the climate change as far as sheep is concerned, and I'll be the first to say that agriculture has a big part to play, particularly around nitrous oxide, which is a far worse climate change impact gas than carbon dioxide. And so we've got issues we need to deal with. But when we just look at numbers like this, it doesn't give us, I believe, a true picture. So looking at the sheep numbers there and the reduction, we are still producing the same quantity of sheep meat for sale. So on a reduction of 50% in numbers, we are 100% improved on our footprint, and no other sector and industry in New Zealand has achieved that in that period of time. Similarly, we could say the production per cow, I don't know what it is, but it will have improved. But we should also be looking at what the global imprint is on animals. And if New Zealand dairying is replacing a worse footprint somewhere else in the world, then that's a net gain. It is a global problem. So just looking at numbers, while it does give us a little snapshot, is not a complete answer in my view. So I just make those points. Any other comments? Someone like to move the recommendations? Thank you, Councillor McCallum, seconded to Councillor Horrell. Those in favour would say aye, against no, that's agreed. Item 4.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rena, thanks very much. The work programme. You can talk to us, Lucy?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. So, take it as read, but just highlight a couple of points for you. The Woodland Land Plan appeals are merrily moving through mediation. We completed subtopic B6 just last week. Elements of it which was relating to infrastructure. Some elements of that mediation will be heading to a hearing, which we knew in advance of going in. So that's the hearing that we anticipate the court will lay down for the third quarter of this year. So probably not before September is what we're hearing, although we don't have a firm date for that yet. We've got mediation on 2 further subtopics next week, wetlands and bed disturbance. And then the final week of mediation is on the 21st of June, and that subtopic is the farming subtopic. There's been a couple of matters carried through that are related to that subtopic that we've pushed further to that one, so that we're carrying out mediation as efficiently and effectively as we possibly can, rather than retraversing things. But we are making good progress. Number of steps that come post-mediation, which I'll be able to talk to you more about once mediation is completed. We've got subcommittee, the appeals subcommittee are meeting on the 2nd of June. That's going to be an important and significant meeting in terms of setting council staff in the right direction for the farming subtopic. So I'll talk more about that with the subcommittee members when we get there.
Okay.
And just one other thing I wanted to highlight apologise for the coastal plan workshop that was set down for next week being pushed out, but it's because of a number of preliminary steps we need to get in order. So the revised date is the 29th of June. For that, it's going to be also a substantial meeting to talk through addressing some of the issues that were raised with councillors previously in regard to Field and Marine Guardians concerns, amongst others. So we've got a proposal for you that we will discuss at that workshop for how we can address some of those concerns. But happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Do we have questions? Councillor McCallum.
Two. One's a comment and the other's really a query. In that first summary page under transport, you've got a comment there, and it's been there for a little bit, is managed stock effluent dump sites across the southern region. I thought we'd done all that. That's not in their work program that I've been involved in for this transport committee. That's not even mentioned.
So through your chair, it's a standing ongoing contract that we have to just pay for the management of the stock effluent sites.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not doesn't take ongoing work from our perspective. It's just simply paying the bills for the.
I was thinking about the setting up and placement of them. The second point, which is a little bit tongue in cheek, is that I wonder whether our proposed Southland Water and Land Plan has been overwritten to the extent by MPSs, NESs and direction from government. I'm not sure how effective that plan is going to be, and it's effectively out of date. We're trying to modernise it, but I wonder whether there's enough direction coming from central government that the effectiveness of that plan is now quite different. It's now 7 or 8 years since it was heard and actually corresponded with the community. I wonder through the appeals process we should be sort of stating that life's moved on to the degree that this plan does not actually carry the weight that it did a number of years ago, and we've got intensive winter grazing workshops and plans coming out that far exceed that plan. Really, it's just about out of date, and we've spent a lot of council money on that system and process, and I just wonder whether we should actually be sort of saying, well, actually, people, let's get a head around reality here. Common sense would tell us, are we going to achieve anything by completing this plan to the detail that some seem to want to, or are we best to move forward to a different regime and start thinking about the next one that's coming up and put the new process around it so it's implemented a lot quicker? And I think the government is frustrated in the time delays, and that's why they've actually come over the top with the MPSs and NESs another direction.
Can I just ask a clarifier? Was there a question in there?
No, I think it's
It was more of a frustration comment about the process.
So we should be thinking about this kind of
Tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, but I just wonder, because you get to the point where, what are we actually trying to achieve here? And I just wonder whether we should not ask ourselves the questions. We ask ourselves the question, are we getting the best bang for buck for the investment?
Yeah.
Because times have changed.
I have a more serious response than a tongue-in-cheek response.
You're not suggesting we do it again, are you?
So the answer to your question is, we do have those conversations ourselves, and we do seriously consider those issues ourselves for exactly those reasons.
Yeah.
And there's an element of exactly that sentiment playing out in mediation as well. A lot of the preliminary steps that the court has required of us in advance of going into mediation is to identify issues that are no longer worth fighting. And that is around what's the NES come over top, what's the MPS direction given us. And I think from the 4 out of 4 mediations that we've done so far, I wouldn't write off the whole plan. There's a lot of it that's really good and useful and will continue to help us as we move forward into the next part. But there are certainly elements of next week's mediation that we're expecting will be mostly having to sort of, our hands are tied on a lot of those matters because the NES has trumped where the plan got to with them. So, yes.
Councillor Horrell.
Well, just following on from Lloyd's comments, I think there is a lot of frustration about the costs and the time it has taken, but we can't abandon it now because it was a platform, it does set up the next process. And government has recognised that with the next plans, we'll be able to fast track. We won't have a whole lot of people being able to sit back and say, well, let's go to the Environment Court, we've got these pockets. They will have to enter into meaningful discussion. It will be a much shorter process. MPSs and NESs we've always had to give effect to anyway. So I think there's been some learnings along the way, and it has been a far longer process than we envisaged it would be. But hopefully the next process is going to be much more efficient, and we'll take those learnings forward.
Councillor Lovelock?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Change the subject completely, well,
Yes.
changing the subject. The air plan and the Clean Air Loan Scheme, I'm getting increasingly concerned that we have to keep putting that on the back burner. Completely appreciate how busy and the workload and all of that stuff, but my question really is there any way that we can get that underway sooner rather than the next LTP cycle?
So through you, Chair, by next LTP cycle, I mean just next financial year. So we'd be anticipating to do the Clean Air Scheme review in July, once we've got the air budget associated to spend on the review. One of the reasons that's not compounded but was fortuitous to hold fire a little is the changes that are happening nationally with the, I'm not going to get the acronym right, EECA and the payment that's coming.
Yeah.
So I went to the Warm Home Trust board meeting, and there was some noise from central government around, we've gone through the money quicker than we thought, and so years to come there may be less of it, and you may have less available to spend on the things that you have been spending it on. And the Warm Homes Trust were flagging with us that they were going to be looking at how they deliver their services as well. So there is a need to do a joined up review of the scheme, and also a cost benefit analysis for how many installs and all those other things. So definitely intending to progress it, but it's not going to get done this side of June.
All right, Councillor Beard?
Thanks, Chairman. My question again on our LiDAR planes. Can they keep flying through the winter period, or is there a window for them to, and then that closes?
So through you, Chair, yep, they're flying. They flew last week or the week before last. Any periods where we've got no clouds, those good days with lots of blue sky, even though it's freezing, they're up there flying. So we had the latest, a whole bunch of new stuff just came through yesterday. So yep, they're up, they're flying. They are not doing as quick as I would like, but they're on track. So yep, still will be flying through the winter. Clear days we need.
So on track to finish.
The contract is the end of next year is when they have to have all of the data completed for Southland.
So as far as being able to know average slopes on our hill country, it's still some time away?
Yeah. What we're dealing with at the moment is the plan for how we use the data as it comes, as opposed to waiting until it's all there. So the way that we also prioritised the project was the coast areas and the estuaries first. So they really do need a couple of days of clear flying and tides to be on track to do those. And yeah, so it's a little way off being able to say this is the average, down to the same resolution as we would like. Probably at least another 6 to 8 months before we've got actual data to share.
Do we have any other questions or comments? If not, would Councillor Hall?
Well, just following on from that, I had a conversation with Steve Kenny last week, who informs me that they finally do have the data on the electromagnetic survey, and I think we'll probably invite him in to
Should have a celebration, Mr. Chairman.
because I think it should be good science, and it will actually dovetail pretty well with LiDAR. I think it probably gives slope, and it's something we've been waiting a long time for, so I really look forward to it.
Through you, Chair, we can certainly arrange something for to come and have a look at that data, but we have had that data in-house for a little while. Lawrence makes use of it in the science division for a raft of things. So yep, happy to do. I'll touch base with Elaine and see if we can, and Steve as well, and see if we can put something in to come and show you that.
Councillor
Just a
Guy?
quick question. Were we provided with the full suite of information, or were we given a selection of views?
Say the full suite, so it was a data set.
Yes.
I think what Rob was talking about, Mr. Chairman, is that there was some deep soil penetration guidance, and then there was also some high level to the first 12 inches or so of soil health and well-being. That's not quite fertility status of the soil, and because that had about 2 or 3 different run systems, and they were saying that they could actually find big levels of water or coal or oil, or, you know, there was like 500 metre window through the profile at the same time. So there was actually more than one thing going on, and that's what we've been looking for.
It wasn't clear at that time whether they were going to provide us with the full suite, so that's why I'm asking.
I will follow up.
All right, have we concluded our discussion on that? So someone like to move the recommendation? Thank you, Stevens and Ludlow. I'll put the question. All those in favour would say aye. Against, no. That's agreed, and I believe that concludes our agenda. So thank you for your attendance. Meeting closed at 11:33-ish.
Technical term.
This.